What if I told you that fascism is doomed to fail wherever it arises? That it's less a coherent political ideology with a future and more so a violent, desperate attempt to reinstitute the class system? Fascism thrives on crisis. It promises order, but delivers chaos. It promises rebirth, but ultimately ends in destruction. And yet, its allure persists even to this day. In this video, we're going to break down fascism to its core, not just what it looks like on the surface, but what drives it and what gives rise to it. You've heard the popular definitions: totalitarianism, mass hysteria, scapegoating, but that's not enough to understand how fascism arises or how to fight it. Fascism isn't an abstract concept, it's a structural response to capitalism in crisis. It's inseparable from the system that gives birth to it. If we want to defeat fascism, we need to understand it, not just its symptoms, but its roots. We'll examine what made fascism possible in interwar Germany and why, despite authoritarian tendencies in modern America, the conditions haven't ripened for fascism proper. And more importantly, we'll ask, what can we learn from history to prevent fascism from gaining a foothold in the future? Before we get into today's deep dive on the structural roots of fascism, I just want to take a moment to tell you about my Patreon. If you've ever wondered about things I don't usually say in public, the spectacle of online drama, or my unfiltered thoughts on the dynamics behind the scenes, that's where I discuss it all. Patreon gives me a space to unpack these ideas honestly and directly with people who are invested in what I do. Recently, I put out an exclusive video where I break down my behind-the-scenes thoughts on the broader cultural machine driving online discourse. It's the kind of candid, unscripted content that I can only do on a platform like Patreon. If that sounds like something you'd enjoy, or if you just want to support the work that I do, head over to patreon.com/Nightmare Masterclass. Every bit of support helps me keep making these videos and exploring the topics that matter most. Now, back to the topic at hand. If we want to defeat fascism, we need to understand not just its symptoms, but its roots. So let's get into it. The popular characterization of fascism. Let's start with a relatively simplistic definition. Fascism isn't just a catch-all term for authoritarianism. It has distinct features. Totalitarian aspiration. The state seeks to dominate every aspect of life, politics, culture, and even private thought. Mythic nationalism. Fascism glorifies an imagined past, blending national identity with racial purity and divine destiny. Sacralized violence. Violence isn't just a tool, it's a virtue, a means of purging weakness and forging a stronger nation. Mass mobilization. Fascism relies on propaganda and mass movements to channel discontent into reactionary fervor. Inherent instability. Fascism thrives on perpetual crisis, which makes it inherently self-destructive. When we think of fascism, Nazi Germany is the archetype, a regime that pursued racial purity, global domination, and the annihilation of its enemies, even at the expense of its own survival. These are not the actions of rational individuals, rather, it's a sort of mass psychosis. Fascism is, in many ways, a country having a manic episode, burning itself out in a blaze of hysteria and violence. But this characterization is where most discussions of fascism stop. It's easy to frame fascism as collective madness or moral failure, but this view reduces it to an abstract phenomenon, divorced from the material conditions that give rise to it. To truly understand fascism, we need to dig deeper. It's not just a psychological or political pathology, it's a structural response to crisis, and it is inseparable from the capitalist system that gives rise to it. What is fascism really? To truly understand fascism, we need to go beyond its surface characteristics and ask, what conditions give rise to it? Fascism isn't just a catch-all term for authoritarianism. It's a specific reaction to the crises of capitalism in the 20th and 21st centuries. Fascism emerges when the contradictions of capitalism, The conflict between labor and capital, the drive for endless accumulation, the inevitable cycles of boom and bust, reach a certain breaking point. It's capitalism's immune system going haywire. It's an attempt to stabilize the system by force when all else fails. Here's how fascism operates within the capitalist epoch. Class crisis management. When capitalism enters a severe crisis, like the Great Depression, it faces the threat of mass revolt. Fascism steps in to destroy class solidarity, redirecting anger away from the capitalist system and towards scapegoats, minorities, immigrants, and political dissidents. Suppression of labor. Fascism crushes unions, bans strikes, and criminalizes dissent. It ensures the continued exploitation of workers while masking this exploitation with a thin veneer of nationalism and unity. State-corporate fusion. Under fascism, the state becomes an enforcer for capital, merging with corporate power to suppress competition, maintain profits, and expand markets. We can think of Nazi Germany's partnerships with industrial giants like IG Farben or Krupp. Mobilization of the middle class. Fascism often draws its base from the petty bourgeoisie and disaffected middle class, groups caught between capital and labor. Due to their particular position in class society, these groups fear downward mobility and cling to fascist promises of stability and national glory. Perpetual crisis and instability. Fascism thrives on crisis because it has no coherent solution to capitalism's contradictions. It's inherently unstable. It relies on perpetual war, violence, and destruction to sustain itself, even as these actions hasten its collapse. Fascism isn't just about authoritarianism or nationalism, it's capitalism's desperate attempt to save itself when it can no longer function through traditional means. It's a death drive masquerading as rebirth. With this materialist framework, we can see why Nazi Germany is often viewed as the archetype of fascism. Its rise wasn't just about Hitler's ideology or the German people's resentment, it was rooted in the specific economic conditions of interwar Europe. The collapse of the Weimar Republic was fueled by the Great Depression, which decimated Germany's economy and left millions unemployed. The capitalist class, fearing socialist revolution, supported Hitler as a bulwark against communism and labor unrest. Subsequently, the Nazis crushed unions, banned strikes, and restructured the economy to serve both the state and corporate interests. The result wasn't a rational solution to the crisis, but a destructive and unsustainable system of racialized violence and militarism. Nazi Germany's genocidal policies and war campaigns were attempts to sustain the system through expansion and extermination, a strategy that was doomed to fail. Social democracy, a flawed solution. It's worth pausing here to recognize a key moment in American history when the country came close to a fascist tipping point, the Great Depression. Rising unemployment, widespread poverty, and political disillusionment created fertile ground for reactionary movements like Father Coughlin's Populism or the America First Committee. But Franklin Delano Roosevelt diffused these tensions, and he did so by giving workers a seat at the table. Programs like Social Security, unemployment insurance, and labor protections channeled class animus into productive reform. FDR recognized the rise of global fascism and fought it by offering workers a seat at the table. However, it's important to note that FDR's social democratic solutions, while effective in stabilizing the country in the short term, did not resolve capitalism's deeper contradictions. Social democracy is, at best, a stopgap, a band-aid on a system that continues to breed inequality and periodic crises. Even the New Deal's ambitious work programs, public infrastructure projects, and financial reforms didn't end the Great Depression. What ultimately pulled the United States out of economic freefall wasn't the New Deal, but the institution of what some might call wartime communism. The mass mobilization of resources during World War II, achieved through centralized planning, direct state control over productive capacity, and military Keynesianism, spurred unprecedented economic growth. Factories that had been idle were repurposed to produce weapons and supplies, and unemployment all but vanished as millions of Americans were conscripted or employed in the war effort. But even this solution wasn't universally replicable. The United States emerged from the war as a preeminent global power, not because of the inherent success of wartime economic planning, but because of the unique geopolitical circumstances. Unlike Europe and much of Asia, which were devastated by the war, the United States was shielded from destruction by its oceans. This separation allowed the U.S. to supply the war effort, rebuild its industrial base, and emerge as the dominant global economy in the post-war period. The Bretton Woods system and the Marshall Plan cemented its economic supremacy, but these outcomes were contingent on factors outside the control of any particular policy. The broader lesson is this: even extraordinary interventions like wartime mobilization do not resolve capitalism's contradictions, they merely displace them. And when those contradictions inevitably reemerge, the conditions that give rise to fascism remain intact. FDR's presidency reminds us that social democracy, while often preferable to reactionary alternatives, cannot eliminate the structural flaws of capitalism. Without systemic change, the crises that give rise to fascism will inevitably return. Historical context: Germany versus 21st century America. To understand why fascism took hold in Germany but hasn't in the contemporary United States, we have to examine the material conditions. Empirical studies highlight that economic instability and high unemployment rates are significant predictors of fascist support, reinforcing the argument that capitalism's inherent crises create fertile ground for authoritarianism. Germany, in the interwar period, was essentially a powder keg. After World War I, the Treaty of Versailles humiliated Germany and crippled its economy. Hyperinflation in the 1920s rendered savings worthless, destroying the middle class. By the Great Depression, unemployment exceeded 30% and millions were on the brink of starvation. Economic institutions collapsed under the weight of mass discontent, creating fertile ground for a charismatic demagogue like Hitler. Now compare that to 21st century America. We have rising inequality, we have stagnant wages, and widespread disillusionment. And I certainly don't want to minimize the suffering anyone is going through right now. In 21st century America, while economic challenges do exist, the conditions differ significantly from those in interwar Germany. As of October 2024, the U.S. unemployment rate stands at 4.1%, indicating a relatively stable labor market. The official poverty rate in 2023 was 11.1%, with 36.8 million people living in poverty. Now, we can certainly bicker about how this information is framed, and it's certainly worth noting that the high rate of underemployment is often not represented in these discussions. But it is nonetheless indisputable that this general picture contrasts sharply with interwar Germany, where hyperinflation and mass unemployment led to widespread destitution and societal upheaval. While contemporary America faces economic disparities and social discontent, the overall living conditions are far more stable and less severe than those that contributed to the rise of fascism in early 20th century Europe. Totalitarianism is a sign of systemic weakness. Totalitarian tendencies, whether in fascist regimes or in more subtle forms of authoritarianism, are ultimately a symptom of a deeper weakness within the system. They signal that the system in question is not robust enough to responsibly manage dissent. A healthy, stable system doesn't need to suppress opposing voices or scapegoat marginalized groups in order to maintain order. It can absorb and respond to critique without unraveling. When we see the rise of these tendencies, whether in interwar Germany or in the 21st century, it's a sign that the system is failing to address the needs of its people. Instead of building consensus or tackling the root causes of unrest, it resorts to repression, surveillance, and the consolidation of power. These are not signs of strength, but fragility, of a system teetering on the edge of its own contradictions. Conversely, liberal democracies excel at co-opting radical movements, absorbing their energy into the system without allowing them to fundamentally challenge the status quo. At the same time, they atomize collective movements by promoting a vulgar individualist ideology, one that frames systemic problems as personal moral failures and reduces solidarity to social competition. These mechanisms ensure that dissatisfaction is either neutralized or redirected in ways that don't fundamentally threaten the system's underlying structure. In this sense, the veneer of freedom in a liberal democracy is actually a more effective tool for social control than outright repression. By channeling dissent into manageable forms, consumer choices, performative activism, or issue-based politics, which are divorced from material struggle, liberal democracies diffuse systemic challenges before they even gain traction. The question, then, isn't just how to resist authoritarianism in its overt forms, but how to unmask and challenge the subtler, more pervasive structures that keep us divided and powerless. The challenge for us today is to recognize these warning signs for what they are and to respond with solutions that address the underlying issues: inequality, alienation, and systemic decay, rather than doubling down on control. The question isn't just how to resist authoritarianism, but how to build a system resilient enough to render fascism once and for all a thing of the past. Conclusion. Fascism isn't just a moral failing or an abstract political ideology. It's a systemic response to crisis, deeply tied to the contradictions of capitalism. It emerges when traditional government can no longer manage the instability created by inequality, exploitation, and economic collapse. Fascism promises order, but delivers chaos. It thrives on perpetual crisis, burning itself out in a blaze of violence and destruction, because it can't reconcile the contradictions it's built upon. So, where does Trump fit into this picture? By the material standards we've explored, Trump is not a fascist per se. He exhibits fascist tendencies, scapegoating, authoritarian rhetoric, an obsession with loyalty, but his actions are driven by self-interest. Trump is an opportunist, a demagogue who thrives on chaos for his own benefit. He lacks the ideological commitment, organizational discipline, and systemic ambitions that define true fascist leaders like Hitler or Mussolini. But here's the danger. Trump has normalized the playbook. His erosion of democratic norms, his vilification of marginalized groups, and his embrace of post-truth politics have laid the groundwork for someone far more disciplined and ideologically driven to step in. Trump isn't fascism's final form. He's a test run. The real threat isn't Trump himself, but what comes after. A figure, perhaps with his charisma, but also with the organizational and ideological focus to carry out a full-blown fascist project. And in the age of neoliberal globalization, the intensification of capitalist competition and uneven economic development often exacerbates social inequalities and alienation throughout the world, thereby increasing susceptibility to fascist ideologies that promise stability and nationalistic revival. Fascism is a global threat, not just something endemic to the US. This is why critical thinking is essential. You cannot fight fascism if you don't understand it. To confront it effectively, we must look beyond its surface traits, the flags, the slogans, the rallies, and examine its structural roots. Fascism doesn't arise in a vacuum. It thrives on the failures of capitalism, on inequality, alienation, and instability. And unless we address these root causes, we'll remain vulnerable, not just to overt authoritarianism, but to the more subtle mechanisms of control that liberal democracies use to suppress dissent and co-opt radical movements. The fight against fascism isn't about resisting bad people or bad ideas. It's about building a society where fascism no longer finds fertile ground. That means confronting systemic inequality, rejecting vulgar individualism, and refusing to settle for superficial reforms that leave deeper problems untouched. The question isn't just how to fight fascism, it's how to ensure that it never arises in the first place.